Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
So now that it's April, planting is hopefully just around the corner. Today we've got Dr. Erin Wilson, a frequent guest on our podcast here to go over some of the weather conditions that are coming up and maybe look back at this winter. Welcome, Erin.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Do you want to start off with and give us, one more time, just let's reflect on what the conditions of 2019 were and what really stands out to you now that a few months have passed?
Yeah, certainly. I think everybody will remember 2019 for many years to come. Obviously, we dealt with a lot of extremes during 2019. Certainly was warmer than average. For Ohio, it was the 12th warmest on record going back to 1895. And it was a wet year. And in fact, 2019 was our sixth wettest on record back to 1895. But that was really, that really hides some details. We know that the first 6 months of 2019 were just so incredibly wet, with many stations across Southwest Ohio, Central Ohio, having received nearly their entire year's worth of normal precipitation in the first 6 months. And then things got really dry, in parts of Ohio, specifically that Southwest, West Central Ohio. And we only saw 14 inches for the rest of the year. So even though it was very wet from an annual statistic, these extremes, cause some issues across the state. And while if we looked at counties from an ag point of view, if we looked at counties east of Columbus, that seemed to be the sweet spot last year. We know the terrible, terrible conditions that we had across Northwest and West Central Ohio that led all to the prevent plant acres and just not being able to get any of the work done. So we know how challenging 2019 is. And so I think as we start looking at 2020's planting season, 2019 is fresh on our minds and we're wondering, hey, what's 2020 have in store? Can we get some different conditions than we saw last year?
Yeah, it's so interesting how averages can really mask those extremes, because we went from being so wet to being so dry down here where I'm at. And, if you just look back at the average, it looks like an average year, but it really wasn't by any stretch of the imagination.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the things that we think about in terms of temperatures as well. We can get back-to-back months where we go from well above average one month to well below average the next month. And from a climate standpoint, that looks like an average season. But we know from, a farming standpoint, the very cold temperatures in April and May really slow our planting activities. And just, on the opposite side of that, a very hot June and July can really, cause some issues on a growing crop as well. So a lot of details, and that's why weather is, I'm a little bit biased, but always a fantastic topic to discuss.
So I asked last fall if we were going to have good snow, because I like to snowmobile, and that didn't pan out well for me at all. So, how do you think the winter compared to what we normally see?
Yeah, so just, personally speaking, I absolutely love winter, like you do as well. And personally, this winter was just terrible, from a snow perspective. Last fall, we were looking at certainly conditions where we thought it was going to be wetter than average, which would have provided, we think, a few opportunities for snowfall throughout the year. The problem with this past winter, problem, from my perspective, but with the issue with the cold air is we had a very strong, what's called an Arctic oscillation, a very strongly positive and Arctic oscillation. And what that does is it basically describes how fast the winds at jet stream level, way up in the atmosphere, are moving and circulating around the Arctic. And when it's really positive, those winds are really strong and it keeps all the cold air really bottled up across the Arctic. And it doesn't allow for cold air outbreaks across the country here in the United States and even across Europe. And so we saw this really strongly positive Arctic oscillation all year long. It kept that warm air or cold air really bottled up across the Arctic. And we ended up here in Ohio with our fifth warmest winter on record going back to 1895. And so it was very, very warm across the region, and that cold air was just not around that much. But we did keep precipitation around. And if you look at precipitation for the winter, it certainly was wetter than average here across our region. So we're starting off with, wet soils around the region pretty much. And we're starting out with some water standing around in some fields as well. Our stream flows are really high. As a matter of fact, back in March, we had some really heavy rainfall that led to some bridges washing out, highways washing out, the flood wall closing on I-71 in Columbus. These indications of just how high the streams around the area have been. So that's how we're starting off this year's planting season. Again, warmer conditions, warmer than average soil temperatures, with plenty of moisture around.
Yeah, that's really interesting because earlier you mentioned how last year the cool temperatures early in spring really slowed down everything warming up. And that's not really what we're experiencing this year. It probably doesn't help that we never really got that cold. The other interesting thing you brought up was, the washing out of roads with all this rainfall we've been getting. Do planning commissions consult with you, and are those considerations being made, maybe talking about changing those 50 or 100-year floodplains?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting topic, and it's certainly a hot topic if you're looking all across the Midwest. A lot of our infrastructure obviously is based on historical precipitation data. That data, we have a product that a lot of most states rely on, which is called the NOAA Atlas 14. It's basically a statistical analysis comparing precipitation events and how likely they are to occur at certain thresholds. So we're more familiar with terms like 1 in 50 year, 1 in 100 year, or 1 in 1,000 year flooding. Again, these are statistical numbers, techniques that are based on a set of stations and their historical precipitation totals. But it's been some time here in Ohio since they've been updated, and so they've not really captured what I would say, certainly the last decade of these really heavy rainfall events that we're seeing more of. 2018 having been the third wettest on record, 2017 was also in the top 10. 6 of our top 10 wettest years have all happened since 2003. And those statistics aren't really captured by these return values. So it's certainly a question that's being asked. As I travel around the state and I talk to soil and water conservation districts throughout the state and talk to local officials, they're thinking about it. They're thinking about, I've got to replace some culverts. ODOT, for instance, has a climate assessment plan where they're looking at every single one of their assets from culverts and highways and bridges and thinking, given the conditions that we're seeing of late, which of these assets are more vulnerable, and what can we do to kind of build up and protect them from frequent flooding. So these conversations are taking place. I certainly don't make any specific guidelines for that, but we know from our statistical analysis that our rainfall is increasing. It's increasing both in the amount we see and also in the heaviest precipitation events where we see 2, 3, or 4-inch rainfall events within an hour or two occurring at more locations across the state. So a very active area of conversation of both research and on the policy or action side. What do we need to do to help shore up our assets?
Well, that's pretty interesting as we see these 50-year floodplains breached time after time in the same season. So it just kind of makes you start to wonder what the future holds for that. And it has a lot of implications, I'd imagine, if they are changed.
Yeah, and I think from a farmer, I think for farmers, when they see many of their fields or their bottom areas for sure frequently flooded, it's a challenge for them as well. The fields are their assets, like the bridges and roads and things like that. So that's why we see, so much concentration on tiling, so much concentration on thinking about controlled drainage structures and, ditches and all of these various conservation measures that are also thought about as well. So I see a lot of action on the water front in general, not just in the quality, and obviously that's the big topic in Ohio as well, but also on quantity. And flooding is much more than just a precipitation story. It's a story about how we develop our urban and suburban areas. It's about how we move and store that water. And I think these topics are only going to become more and more pressing, given the fact that we expect these increases in rainfall to continue throughout the 21st century.
And then at the same time, we see irrigation expanding across the state. I mean, especially in my area where we've got some of that gravel bottom ground because we have the dry summers. So it's just an interesting time. All of these considerations and kind of where we stand right now, what are we looking at for spring of 2020?
Yeah, and if I can go back and just address that, question you were talking about irrigation and dry summers. We know that seasonally we're not increasing rainfall in all of our seasons. It's mostly our cool season, fall, winter, and spring. And then, like you said, we still see these dry periods in summer. And as a matter of fact, our statistics are indicating that July, August, a lot of our precipitation trends over the last 50 to 60 years are flat to even negative. So in a year like 2019, where we can be so wet during the planting season and then flip so dry during the growing season, it is actually becoming more prevalent. It's becoming more frequent across the region. And so, yeah, while we're dealing with mostly excess water conditions, there are periods where we see these short, intense dry periods that are just as challenging when we need that water for the growing crop. So we have to think about the irrigation, the water storage as well. So as we start to turn now and we think about our conditions heading into spring, we could certainly start with how March ended, which is on a very wet note. As a matter of fact, several stations across Ohio are ending March, have ended March close to, or even in the top 10 wettest Marches, going back to 1895, which is quite astounding when you think about a lot of the flood events across Ohio. Like 1913 was a March event with an average of almost 9 inches across the state. So this is certainly, March is certainly a time where we see a lot of that flooding. So we're heading into spring, heading into our planting season more specifically with wet soils, high stream flows, and warm ground temperatures. Our outlooks and the things that we're looking at now that we're in April, certainly the first part of April, thankfully, we're looking at a break of a little bit drier weather here. Our probabilities in the very short term, over the next week or two, really show drier than average conditions, but also cooler than average conditions, most likely. And so with cooler than average conditions this time of year in Ohio, we're talking 40s and 50s for highs, and that can limit the drying that we really need to take place. If we're spending many days of dry weather in our 60s, 70s with plenty of wind, that can help evaporate that moisture. But if we're sitting in the 40s and 50s with some clouds overhead, that's going to limit the amount of drying that can take place over the next week or two. On the longer term, looking at the next really 30 days here in April, the Climate Prediction Center shows us really an equal chances of above, below, and near normal conditions. And that can seem confusing. It basically just means we don't have a strong signal either way, but you don't have to go very far where the outlooks are really depicting wetter than average conditions stretching from Iowa southeast through Kentucky. And if I had to make a prediction here at the 1st of April, we're really looking at leaning at least normal, if not a little bit toward the wetter than average conditions for the month. And I think ultimately we'll end up a little bit above average as well. With the warm ground that we've seen, that we have right now, our overnight temperatures aren't really falling off to any record lows that we anticipate. And then unfortunately, when we look at the Climate Prediction Center out the next 3 months, the April, May, and June outlooks that came out in late March, we're looking at a higher probability of above average precip for this 3-month period. And Ohio is really the bullseye. From Ohio back toward Indiana and Northern Illinois is just an area that's been targeted, that's showing up in our climate models and also our long-term climate signals of having a wet spring, a wetter than average spring for sure. And so again, we're immediately drawn back to 2019 and thinking, as severe and as troubling as 2019, we certainly don't want to see anything like that again. And we can't predict a 2019 happening again. One of the things that made 2019 unique was our May rainfall, rainy days. Many locations had reports of 20 to 26 days of rainfall during the month of May. And that's what was particularly challenging, not just the amount of rainfall, was just the number of rainy days and the inability to dry our soils. If our temperatures pan out warmer than average, which we do expect them to, April, May, and June on the whole, then we could have some drying opportunities. And so while I don't expect 2019 to be as bad as 2019, actually, I think it's pretty safe, honestly, to think about that, just as extreme as some things about 2019 were for us. I do think that there will be periods or areas of Ohio that see similar challenges from a wet soil standpoint. So, I know immediately that throws caution in terms of, we need to avoid compaction in our fields. And I know all of our farmers are eager to get out there and get started, but, making sure that the field conditions are good for that. I think that's going to have to be in the decision-making toolbox this spring as we deal with wet conditions once again here across the Ohio Valley.
That's a great forecast, Aaron. I mean, what I'm hearing you say to our farmers here is, find your windows, don't panic, plant when we can. And I think really one thing that we learned from 2019, what made 2019 so scary was that we really didn't know what was going to happen when we pushed our planting dates back as far as we did. And coming off of that year and everything we learned, I think we can go in with a little more confidence that early June isn't really a time to start panicking quite yet.
And I agree. I'm always looking for, the good angles, the silver linings, and some of the things throughout the winter, thinking about the fact that last fall wasn't nearly as wet as the fall before. Even though it's been wet this winter through March, so January through March, again, we've not been as wet as our January through March last year. And finally, with the warm soil temperatures, even though we need to think about pests and weeds and things that probably overwintered, the fact that the temperatures were not frozen, the soils were not frozen throughout the winter, water was able to run. And I think that's why we've seen our really high stream flows as well. So those three combinations right there, I think, put 2020 in a slightly better position than what we saw just a year ago.
Yeah, and I think we're a little bit better prepared to, Elizabeth mentioned the experience we had with 2019, but I think farmers are going to take it pretty seriously, being ready to roll when they have the opportunity to, so they can get out there and take advantage of any early windows that we have and make that planting happen when they can. Well, Aaron, thanks again. We appreciate the work that you do for us. We've shared your resources before, but you're continually putting forecasts out there on your social media and the Byrd Polar website. So anything new on that front that you want to share?
I just to remind folks out there that the weekly hydroclimate video, 5 to 10 minute video, is up and running again for the season. So I'll be pushing those out through the Facebook and Twitter, and also at climate.osu.edu. Our website at climate.osu.edu will be undergoing a transition between April 1st and April 8th. And after that, you'll see a new website there, and hopefully a little bit easier to see some of the content there as well. So please feel free to check back and check out those weekly updates, as certainly our forecast will change as we know more. And you can always reach me at wilson.1010@osu.edu. Weather is not just small talk. I love talking about weather any day, anytime. So please reach out. Thank you for all you do, and it's awesome to serve you in whatever way I can. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Aaron.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.